Arizona Territory, June 1882, the heat clung to the air like a wool blanket, thick and dry, as the church bell rang hollow through the dust. Inside the small white clapboard chapel on the edge of Bisbee, the wooden pews were half filled, the sunlight slanting through the stained glass in tired streaks of red and gold. Sweat beaded on foreheads, fans fluttered in gloved hands, and the silence stretched too long. Laramie Albright stood alone at the altar, her hands trembling around a bouquet of wild daisies. Her white dress, handmade with lace she had sewn herself over the winter, felt too tight now, like it was choking the breath from her lungs. The preacher cleared his throat. A woman near the back whispered, not softly enough, "He is not coming." Laramie blinked but did not cry. Not yet. She stared at the open doors past the empty road as if he might still ride in, dust trailing behind him like something out of a dime novel. But the sun kept climbing, and the man she was supposed to marry, Daniel, childhood sweetheart, beloved of her parents, the future she had built in her mind every night for 10 years was nowhere. He had left her. Just like that, the preacher stepped back. A few guests stood awkwardly. Someone coughed. Laramie's hands fell to her sides, the bouquet slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Miss Albright," she turned. A tall man stepped forward from the back pew, removing his hat with a slow, respectful gesture. He looked out of place in the church, dust on his boots and shirt, his dark blonde hair windblown. His eyes were a cool gray, steady and kind, and his face had the kind of quiet strength that came from years of sun and labor. "I am sorry to step in like this," he said, his voice low but sure. "But it does not feel right, seeing you standing there alone." She stared at him. She knew his face vaguely. He worked cattle out near the Dragoon Mountains, came into town every now and then for supplies. His name floated up from memory. "Nash Everett," she said, the words dry on her tongue. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am, you are not supposed to be here." "No," he said, "but I was." The church was nearly empty now. The guests had begun to leave, shuffling out with murmurs and sideways glances. Laramie stood frozen, her spine stiff, her eyes locked on his. He stepped closer slowly, like approaching a skittish horse. "I do not know what made that man ride off," Nash said, "but I do know a good woman when I see one." He reached out his hand, open and steady. "If you want, we could try anyway." Laramie blinked again. Her heart was pounding, sharp and fast. Her throat tightened, not from grief, but from something else, something unexpected, something wild. "You do not even know me." He gave a half smile, soft and warm. "Then let us fix that." The words were not fancy, there was no grand gesture. Just a man standing in the wreckage of the worst moment of her life, offering her a hand. And Laramie, eyes stinging but dry, placed her hand in his. They left the church together. The next morning, the town woke to more gossip than it knew what to do with. Laramie Albright had not gone home to her family's boarding house after the failed wedding. Instead, she had taken a room at the small 2-room cabin Nash Everett kept near the ridge above Tombstone Creek. Not in sin he had slept on the porch, she inside, but it was enough to stir every tongue in Bisbee. Laramie did not care. She spent her days sweeping the dust from the porch, mending a shirt of his, sitting beside him as he worked leather or fixed a fence rail. They spoke in pieces, quiet and slow. "What made you decide to speak up?" she asked one evening as the sun set behind the hills. "I saw you standing there," he said, not looking up from his work. "And I thought, if I had ever been lucky enough to be loved by someone like you, I would never walk away." She looked down at her hands, fingers stained from blackberry juice. "He did not love me," she admitted. "Not really, I think I knew it. I just thought maybe marriage would fix it." Nash set the tool aside. "You do not need fixing," her breath caught. He meant it. He had not touched her, not even once. But every word he said brought her closer to something she could not name yet. By the end of the week, they shared meals. By the end of the month, they shared laughter. By the end of summer, they shared everything. Still, Nash never rushed her. It was Laramie who reached for his hand first on the ridge one night, under a sky so wide it made her feel small in the best way. He had just finished telling her about his younger brother, lost to fever in Kansas when they were boys. She placed her hand over his and said, "You are not alone anymore." He looked at her then, his eyes soft, and leaned in, slow and careful. Their kiss was quiet, like everything else between them, simple, sure, and honest. "I never thought I would feel this again," she whispered, forehead resting against his. "I never thought I would feel it at all," he said. That fall, they rode back into town together. Not to marry in the church, not yet. But to buy supplies, hand in hand, heads high. The stairs did not bother her anymore. Let them talk. She had been left at the altar in a dusty old church. A cowboy had taken her hand, and they were trying anyway. And deep down, Laramie knew this time it was real. The first hard frost came early that year. By late October, the mesquite leaves along the creek had yellowed and begun to fall, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and old sage across the ridges. Laramie stood outside the cabin one morning, her shawl drawn tight, watching Nash chop cedar rounds by the lean-to. Each swing of the axe sent a clean, sharp crack into the stillness, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest, a steadiness she hadn't known she'd needed. She hadn't returned to her family's house since that day at the church. Her father sent a letter once, terse and folded without care, telling her she was welcome home if she came alone. She'd pressed it flat and placed it in the bottom drawer of Nash's small writing desk without a word. That morning, while Nash stacked the split logs, she stepped off the porch and passed through the thin frost dusting the grass. "You were right," she said, nodding toward the axe. "That cedar burns hotter." He glanced up, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. "Learned it from an old cowhand in Sonora. Said it keeps the cold from getting into your bones." He paused. "I figure you're still carrying enough of that already." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she crouched beside the growing pile of kindling, brushing cedar needles off a flat stump. "Are you always this patient?" "I had to be," he said, laying another round on the chopping block. "My mother passed when I was 12. After that, it was just my pa and me. He weren't much for talking. So I learned to wait and listen." She tilted her head, studying the curve of his jaw, the way his eyes didn't shift away from hers when he spoke. "That's why you never push." "Not once." "I figure if someone's already been pushed too far," he said, "the last thing they need is more of it." The axe bit deep, and he split the round clean in two. Later that week, as the wind picked up and the clouds gathered low and gray over the hills, Laramie sat on the floor beside the hearth, sewing new buttons onto the collar of a worn flannel shirt Nash had left folded over the chair. He came in from tending the horses, his coat damp with sleet, shaking the weather off his shoulders. "You'd think this cold was trying to prove something," he muttered, hanging his hat on the peg. "You always talk to the weather like it's listening." He pulled off his gloves and crouched beside her. "Sometimes I reckon it is. It listens better than most folks anyway." She threaded the last button and held the shirt up, inspecting her work. "There. Good as new." He reached out, brushing his fingers along the seam she'd mended. "You've got a way with things that need fixing." She didn't laugh. "That's not always true." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "It is with me." The fire crackled between them, the scent of burning cedar rising sweet and sharp. She leaned against the hearthstone and let the warmth soak into her. For a long moment they sat without speaking. Then she asked, "Did you ever think about marrying?" Before, his jaw shifted slightly. "Once. Back when I was working cattle up near Hallbrook, there was a girl her folks ran a dry goods store, but I was too wild then, too restless. I didn't know yet what it meant to stay." She nodded, weighing what he'd said. "And now," he leaned back on his heels. "Now I know what I'd give up to keep someone, and what I wouldn't walk away from." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. That night, when sleet turned to snow and the cabin walls creaked with wind, they sat side by side on the narrow bed, neither speaking until hours had passed. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he didn't move, just let her be there. In the dark, she whispered, "I'm not the same woman I used to be." He answered without hesitation. "Good. She deserved better, and now she's getting it." He shifted, pulled the wool blanket higher over her shoulders. Quiet settled between them again, not empty, but full of something hard-earned and strangely tender. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and silent, like it had nowhere else to be. The ground thawed slow come March, and with it, the creek behind the cabin started running again, full of meltwater and cold as old iron. Laramie stood barefoot on the flat stone where the bank dipped low, hem of her dress hitched above her knees, washing the winter linens by hand. Her fingers ached from the chill, but she welcomed it. There was something honest in the sting-proof of a season past, a life remade behind her. Nash was mending the fence that ran along the north side of the pasture. The cattle hadn't wandered far during the freeze, but the rails had shifted, and the gate latch had rusted through. He worked without hurry, sleeves rolled, his weight moving steady over each task. She liked to watch him and quiet his movements plainspoken, without waste. "You ever think about putting in a garden?" she asked, wringing out a pillowcase and laying it flat across the rock. He leaned against the fence post, brushing sawdust from his palms. "I've thought on it." Never had someone to grow one for. She glanced back at him, sunlight catching the side of her face. "I've still got seed from last year, peas, squash, some onions. They'll take if the frost stays gone." He nodded once. "Then we'll put one in." That was how things were between them now. Not questions so much as offerings. Not plans, but shared direction. That night, Laramie sat at the table with a sheet of parchment and a stub of pencil, sketching out the rows for the garden. Nash was sharpening the blade of his scythe by the fire, the slow rasp of the whetstone rhythmic as a lullaby. "Were you always out this way?" she asked, not looking up from the page. "No," he said. "Grew up near the Cimarron, farther north. We moved south after the war when the land got stripped bare and the cattle died off. My father took what we had left and followed the promise of open range." She set the pencil down. "Did you ever go back?" He shook his head. There wasn't anything left to return to. She reached across the table, resting her hand over his. "You think this place is enough for you now?" His eyes met hers. "It's more than I ever expected." Later, as the fire burned low and the wind turned warmer, they stood beneath the rafters of the porch, watching stars blink into place one by one. "I used to pray for a different life," she said. "Not grand, just less hollow. Something where I could wake up and not feel like I'd failed before I'd even begun." Nash didn't speak right away. He stepped behind her, his arms coming around her waist, loose and sure. "You didn't fail," he said. "That man left because he didn't know what it meant to build a life with someone. You stayed standing, and then you took a step forward." She leaned back into him, letting the warmth of his body soften something in her that had stayed tight for too long. "I want to marry you," she said, voice low, but without hesitation. He kissed the top of her head, slow and certain. "Then we will." They didn't pick a day. No need. They both knew it would come when the earth was ready, when the garden was planted, when the creek ran clear, when the world had shaken off the last of its cold. The soil turned dark and damp beneath their hands as March waned into April. Laramie wore a wide-brimmed hat of Nash's, the crown too deep for her head, but it kept the sun off her neck as she knelt beside the furrows they'd carved into the earth. She pressed seeds into the damp, rose peas first, then beans, while Nash brought buckets from the creek, pouring slow to keep the ground from washing out. "We'll need a scarecrow," she said, brushing dirt from under her nails. "Crows'll come for the sprouts soon as they break ground." "I'll rig something up out of my old duster," Nash said. "That thing's seen more wind than wear lately." She smiled, but her focus stayed on the soil. The garden, like so much else between them, wasn't about beauty, it was about trying. About putting something in the ground and hoping it took. That evening, Nash brought in a small pine box he'd made. He set it on the table without saying anything and opened the lid to show her what he'd carved inside: 2 rings, simple and smooth, one slightly smaller than the other, shaped from deer antler and sanded until they shone like ivory. Laramie reached for the smaller one, running her thumb along the inside. "You made these. Didn't want to buy something from town that had no part of us in it," he said. "Found the shed last winter up on the ridge, been saving it." She slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit. Nash didn't ask, and she didn't answer out loud. She just stood, went to him, and leaned her forehead against his chest. He rested his chin in her hair, arms around her, and no more needed to be said. They married 3 days later under the cottonwoods near the creek. The preacher from Sulphur Springs rode out quiet, no questions asked. There were no guests, no music. Just them, a patch of sky, and the hush of old trees. After the vows, Nash didn't kiss her right away. He waited, hands holding hers, until she rose on her toes and kissed him first. It was gentle and sure, the kind of kiss that carried the weight of what they'd already endured and what they still meant to build. That night, they cooked pinto beans and cornbread over the fire, the cabin warm with the low hum of peace. Laramie leaned back in her chair, bare feet tucked beneath her, watching Nash carve new fence stakes by lantern light. "You ever think about what comes after this?" she asked. He looked up, knife paused mid-stroke. "After what? This, the quiet, the work." "The two of us," he considered for a moment. "I figure it'll be more of the same, just with time wrapped around it. Maybe a porch swing, maybe more hands in the garden." She didn't need to ask if he meant children. The way he said it, not as a dream, but a natural turn in the road, settled something inside her. "You'd be a good father," she said. He set the knife down. "Only if I had you beside me." Outside, the wind carried the scent of mesquite blossom. The moon hung low and full above the ridge. Laramie stood, walked to where he sat, and lowered herself into his lap. He held her there, his cheek against her temple, both of them quiet as the fire crackled beside them. She didn't need the church or the altar or the crowd of eyes. She had this: a man who stayed, a life they chose, and a future they would shape with their own hands. And in the hush of that spring night, she knew with a certainty that didn't need naming, they had tried. And it was enough. By late June, the garden had taken root in earnest. The beans climbed thin stakes in rows as straight as fence wire, and the squash leaves sprawled wide, soaking up every drop of sun. Laramie woke early most mornings before the heat settled to tend the rows in her bare feet. Her hands had long since hardened along the palms from digging and weeding, and she liked the way the dirt no longer clung to her skin like it used to. It welcomed her now, gave more than it took. One morning, as she knelt to check the underside of a cabbage leaf for beetles, Nash stepped out from the barn with a fresh pail of milk and a calm look on his face. "Neighbor's bull wandered in again," he said, setting the pail by the porch. "Found him halfway down the creek, chewing on our cottonwood roots." She wiped her brow with the crook of her arm. "That the same one with the crooked horn?" "Same one." He leaned on the post rail. "I figured we might ride out and talk with Mrs. Baines after supper. She's getting on in years. Might be time we helped mend her gate for her." Laramie bent to gather the basket of radishes she'd pulled. "We've got shingles left from the chicken coop. Should be enough." It had become their way, doing what needed doing, and never just for themselves. Since their wedding, folks from the nearby homesteads had started passing by more regular, not out of curiosity but comfort. Nash was known for never charging for help with a broken axle or a stuck well, and Laramie's salves, brewed with yarrow and wild mint, had eased more than one newborn's colic. That same afternoon, as she returned from the east pasture with a bundle of sweetgrass for drying, she found Nash sitting beneath the cottonwoods with a square of muslin stretched tight across a wooden frame. He was stitching, slowly, with thick thread and deliberate fingers. She crouched beside him. "What are you making?" He didn't answer right away, just turned the square so she could see a shaped outline of a bird in flight, its wings spread wide across the cloth. "Thought I'd hang it above the bed," he said. "Something to look at come winter." She touched the edge of the fabric. "You ever sew before?" "Watched my mother back when I was small. Never forgot the way her hands moved. Seems I've got that part in me too." She rested her hand on his shoulder. "I like that you do." The sky stretched pale and cloudless above them, and the hush of the trees made time feel slower, easier. She stayed there beside him, watching the thread pass through fabric, each stitch a quiet promise made visible. That night after they'd ridden to Mrs. Baines' place and helped repair the broken gate latch with what they had left in the wagon, they sat on her porch drinking chicory coffee, the old woman wrapped in a wool shawl despite the heat. "She told me something," Laramie said later, as they rode home beneath a sky full of stars. Said she used to believe love was a fire that burned fast, but now she sees it more like a kettle over coals, steady, quiet, and always there when you need it. Nash nodded, reins loose in his hands. "I'd say she's right." July brought storms that rolled in low and sudden from the west. One evening, the sky turned the color of tarnished brass, and just before dusk, the wind snapped a branch from the cottonwood and sent it crashing through the chicken coop roof. They worked together through the rain, patching the opening with spare tarred canvas, the slick boards cold under their palms. By the time they'd finished, they were soaked to the skin and laughing, not from humor, but from the sheer wildness of it all. Inside the cabin, they stripped out of their wet clothes and wrapped themselves in the quilt Laramie had pieced through winter. She sat with her feet in his lap, steam rising from the kettle as it hissed on the stove. "I never thought I'd be glad for a broken roof," she murmured. He brushed a drop of water from her cheek with his thumb. "I never thought I'd be glad I walked into that church." She looked at him then, her eyes soft and steady. "You saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have liked much." "I didn't save you," he said. "You chose something better. I just stood still long enough for you to find it." They slept that night with the windows open, the scent of wet earth drifting in, the hush between them full of trust. By summer's end, the garden yielded more than they could eat. She canned jars of beans and stewed tomatoes, lined them on the shelf beside the hearth. Nash carved pegs for hanging herbs along the rafters, and the cabin filled with the scent of drying thyme and lavender. In early September, Laramie missed her monthly bleeding and felt no surprise when the signs came one by one: the tenderness in her breasts, the quiet fatigue, the sudden craving for cornmeal griddle cakes. One morning, as they stood side by side at the creek, she placed his hand gently over her belly. "I think we'll need a cradle come spring." He didn't speak, only stepped close and rested his forehead against hers, his hand still over the curve of her hips. Then he kissed her slow and sure, like the world had never been anything but this moment. "I'll build it," he said finally. "Strong enough to last." Years passed as they always do. Their first child, a girl with Laramie's dark hair and Nash's gray eyes, was born in April, just as the peach tree behind the cabin bloomed for the first time. A second child came 2 years later, and the cradle Nash had carved was passed down, one child to the next. The porch grew worn where little feet ran back and forth, and the garden stretched wider each season. Laramie taught the children to read by lamplight, their heads bowed over books borrowed from the traveling circuit rider. Nash taught them to ride with soft hands and steady reins. They never left the homestead. They never needed to. Their love didn't blaze, it didn't need to. It held, like a river that never ran dry, quiet and enduring, wrapped around every part of the life they built together. And when the years lined their faces and silvered their hair, they still rose before sunup, still sat side by side on the porch as dawn opened across the hills. Still reached for each other in sleep. They had tried, and it had been more than enough. It had been everything.